This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest, Bill Schnee, author of Chairman at the Board, recording the soundtrack of a generation. Chairman at the Board is an intimate, funny, and absorbing look at the music business by an insider who has recorded a host of the greatest musical artists from the 1970s to today. Bill Schnee takes the reader inside the studio, behind the curtain, and through the decades with a cavalcade of famous artists as he helped them to realize their vision. After his high school band was dropped by Decca Records, Schnee began his quest to learn everything he could about making records. Mentored by technical guru Toby Foster, mastering guru Doug Sax, and recording legend Richie Podolor at his American recording studio, he immediately began recording the top acts of the day as a freelance engineer/producer in Hollywood. Clive Davis soon hired him to work for CBS, where he partnered with famed music producer Richard Perry. Schnee went on to record and/or mix many of Perry's biggest albums of the 70s and 80s, including those by Barbra Streisand, Carly Simon, Ringo Starr, Art Garfunkel, and the Pointer Sisters. With his deft personal touch with musicians, Schnee continued to engineer and/or produce the likes of Marvin Gaye, Thelma Houston, Pablo Cruz, Neil Diamond, Boz Scaggs, the Jacksons, Huey Lewis and the News, Dire Straits, and Whitney Houston. With over 125 gold and platinum records and 2 Grammys for Steely Dan's Asia and Gaucho, Schnee has been called a living legend, recognized and respected in the industry as the consummate music man, with an incomparable career that he lovingly shares with his readers in humorous detail. Now here to talk about the book is the author and the man who lived the story he tells, Bill Schnee. To hear the songs discussed in this episode, check out the show notes page. Bill Schnee, thanks so much for being on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Your story, what a story it is. It begins on 4th of July, 1947. That's the day you're born. Talk about your early days growing up in Arizona, when music entered your life.
Well, as I was an only child, and I didn't really enjoy it. Some of my friends that are only children seem to like it, but I didn't like it that much. But instead of imaginary friends, I had the radio, and I started listening to, I just absorbed myself with the music on the radio, which in those days, the disc jockeys held all the power, and they weren't confined to playlists. At least in Arizona, they weren't on AM radio. And in a 3-hour segment, the disc jockey could play anything he wanted. They usually had, their favorite kind of genre, but it wasn't unusual to hear a Sinatra record after some hillbilly record. So that's what got me started listening to music for sure.
Yeah, there was a wide array of music that DJs played back in the day. I worked during the period in radio when I had a playlist all the time, and it was very infrequent that I could put in a song of my own. And if I did, I'd have to get permission. Is it okay? Certain songs you play during the day, certain songs you play at night. So that was a great time to listen to the radio. Do you have any favorite DJs back in those days?
Oh, I couldn't remember their names, but as to what you said, yeah, when you were in, it was that, not too long after that in the major markets, there were 18 songs, and that was all anyone was going to play, period. Yeah. And I go off a little on that in the book about how frustrating I think it is to have the musical dog being wagged by the radio tail. Radio basically telling the record companies what kind of music they should make.
Yeah, we'll get to that with the Huey Lewis story. That did come into play. You eventually moved to San Francisco. You get your first stereo, and this is when you really develop a fascination for not just the music, but the sound of records and the legendary American composer Henry Mancini and his engineer Al Schmidt. And you really took to the music that they recorded. And he did the theme song for the Peter Gunn TV series, Pink Panther theme, Moon River, From Breakfast at Tiffany's. He's won an astounding 23 Grammys, and you later became friends. What was it about those Mancini songs that connected with you?
Just basically the musicality of it, the melodies and the orchestrations, the way Hank did things like that. And as you say, I had just gotten into hi-fi at that point. I was becoming an audiophile, as they would say. And those were some outstanding sounding records. And they didn't give very many engineers credit back then, but Mancini made sure that Al always got credit. And of course, with the name Schmidt and my name Schnee, I had an instant camaraderie with him, at least in my head. So the cute part of the story, I think, is that quite a few years later, like in the mid 70s, I'm almost 15 years later, I'm working alongside him in a studio. And I get to meet him, and let's go to lunch. And we go to lunch, and we sit down and broke a little bread. And I said, I got to tell you, Al, you're a real genius. And he, oh, I'm not a genius. I'm not a blah, blah, blah. I said, well, I've recorded in those studios at RCA on Sunset, and I have no idea how you could make those Mancini records sound like that in those rooms that were definitely dead, on the deader side. And he looks at me like I'm an idiot, and he says, I didn't do those records there. I did them on the original RCA studio on Sunset and Vine. And I went, oh, okay. Yeah, you're not a genius then.
That's great. Well, another who you later became friends with and worked with, Herb Alpert. His record with the Tijuana Brass, The Lonely Bull, you cite as another album as a big reason for your interest in electronics in high school. You joined the PA crew, doing sound for assemblies and plays, and this is more than just something to pass the time. Now, this becomes a serious thing for you. You read about buying a bunch of different electronic bits at Army surplus stores and taking them home to see if you can get them working. What do you remember most about those days?
What I remember most was taking the bus all the way from where we lived in the Seacliff district of San Francisco down to Market Street, and then coming back on the bus carrying this bag of stuff. But yeah, I got interested in electronics on a more serious level, and would buy these bits and come home and take them apart and see if I could figure out how they worked and tinker with them and make them work.
Did you think at that point, you must have been, 15 or 16? Were you thinking career at that point, or just too young?
Just not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. Just an interest.
From San Francisco to Los Angeles you go, and then at the age of 16, you move to Glendora, and this is where the Beach Boys enter your world. Your first band is called the LA Teens, where you play Hammond organ, mixture of British invasion rock and the Beach Boys, and this was your first record label experience. It was real promise to start. The LA Teens have a meeting with Capitol Records, and as you write, 1 minute the future looked wide open, and now it seemed over. Can you talk about that? What happened there?
Well, our band, we went and did some demos and sent them off to a guy that one of the kids' mothers knew someone who knew someone in the business, and that was Gary Usher, who was actually friends with the Beach Boys and wanted to be a Beach Boy, but they chose Al Jardine over him, I guess. But he did write 409 and In My Room with Brian. And we recorded at Capitol and Western, two of the best studios at the time in Hollywood, still to this day, actually. And Gary brought in a session guitarist to augment the band named Richie Podolor, incredible musician who played guitar on our singles. And in those days, you recorded 4 singles, and if you had a hit, you ran in and cut 6 more songs, and you'd have an album. And unfortunately, the LA Teens did not make an album. So we got dropped, and went to Richie's studio to tell him the sad news. And he said, oh, you guys were great. I'll get you another record deal, which he did. And we recorded our first track in his studio, which was much funkier than Capitol and Western. But when I came in for the playback and listened to what was coming out of the speakers, it was a real life-defining moment for me, because the band had never sounded like that. There was an immediacy. It was more musical somehow there, and I just realized right then what a difference the recording could make in the emotion of the music that was being played back. And I literally turned to him and pointed at all the equipment and said, can you teach me how to do this? And he said, no, I'm teaching Bill Cooper over here. Just go out and do another take, please. So, but that was the as I said, life-defining moment for me.
Yeah, and your career was only just getting started. Chapter 2, A Change Is Going to Come. You start working at Mark's studio in Glendora. In exchange for operating the equipment and use their studio, you offered to sweep the floors if you had to. What comes to mind when you look back on those days? The learning experience that you'll never forget?
Yeah, the silly part about that, I don't know what it is that that was a very, very unprofessional studio. Meaning, first of all, it was only 2-track when it was 4-track was the state of the art, but it was only 2-track, which meant everything was live. And it was basically a little home garage studio that he put into a building. So it was, he only had 2 condenser professional microphones and egg cartons on the wall for sound absorption. And so I wasn't really able to learn that much in terms of the real technology, except what I learned was because I started doing sessions, and within 6 months, he thought I was better than he was, which I don't know if it was saying that much, but I was doing all of the sessions. And so what it did teach me right from the beginning was mixing. So that everything, because now when they played and sang, you made their record by mixing. So that turned out to be an invaluable jumpstart.
And the first major artist you recorded was Three Dog Night, and you write about how impressed you were with watching a professional band record. A Change Is Gonna Come was the first song you recorded?
Yeah. Well, the way it worked out is that in that Mark studio, he finally bought a homemade 4-track, and I said, how are we going to do that? Because all we had was a little mixer with no EQ, no tone controls, and just a Fisher Space Expander spring reverb for echo. And he said, like this, and he plopped on another little mixer. And I said, no, that's not going to work. We need a console. So he found this guy, Toby Foster, in San Diego, who drove up, and we talked about what he could make, and he made us a very inexpensive real console. And but Toby went on to get a job in LA as a mastering engineer and a tech. And by now I've quit college again. I mean, I've gone back to college. I quit for 2.5 years to chase the LA teens. So now I'm back in college, and every day after school, I would drive to him in where he was working and just barrage him with questions. And where I started college in aerospace, and so where my left brain and right brain meet in the middle, I guess, has made learning engineering and the technical aspects of it just like a walk in the park. And so just 2.5 years later, from the time I had that aha moment at Podolor's, I was able to talk him into giving me a job there. And he started me on a demo, which the client said I did fine. Then the next day, another demo. And then so the third day, he said, okay, why don't you come and record with Three Dog Night? And this is an amazing story to me, one of the most amazing parts of my story, because at that point in time, Richie was only engineering Three Dog Night. And his major client was their producer, Gabriel Meckler, who was also producing Steppenwolf, that Richie had also done their first record. And here he is working on the second record of Three Dog Night. They've already had a hit, and they're working on the second record on their way to being one of the biggest bands in the country. And he throws this kid in to work with his biggest client. And so what in the world sense does that make? If I'd fallen on my face, he would have looked like an idiot and might have lost his client. But yes, Change Is Gonna Come, the old Sam Cooke song, it was the first thing I did. And I called him the next day. What'd Gabriel say? He said, yeah, he said you were fine. So what now? Well, come in tonight and do another one. So I came in that night and recorded Circle for a Landing. Called him the next day. Yep, keep going. On the third night, I got in trouble. They wanted some guitar sound that I had no idea how to do. And of course, Richie, being the great guitar player that he was, I'm sure on the first album, they had gotten used to Richie helping him with guitar sound. So I had to call Richie, and he and Bill came down and took over. But that was the story of me being thrown in the deep end of the pool and managing to swim.
Best way to learn is that way, right? Just get thrown right in there, I suppose.
Well, when it works, when you don't drown, I think you're right.
Yeah, if you drown, then yeah, you look back.
Actually, funny enough, years later, when I built my studio, the second guy I hired to train, I thought he could swim better than he could, and I threw him in the deep end, and he didn't quite drown, but he was definitely working to get back to the top, and I had to slow down with him. Now, he would go on to become one of the best seconds I trained, but yeah, maybe not the best way, but yeah. It sure worked for me at least.
Do you still go back and listen to those early songs you record every now and then?
I never would have until I wrote a book. And writing the book was, really, really a blast, actually, to go through. I've just been working the whole time, right? 50 whatever years it is now, and I know I've had an unbelievably blessed career. I know that, all the artists I worked with, but to go back and actually start talking about it and whatnot has really been great. And so, yeah, back then I would go as I was writing the book, I would go back and listen to some of the stuff.
What goes through your mind when you listen to it? Are you satisfied with it? Does your mind now, all these years later, say, boy, maybe I would have done that differently, or maybe I would have?
I'm obviously, maybe it's not obvious. Yeah, it's obvious. I'm my biggest critic. And so I'm not going to be that happy almost ever. Now, if it's a big hit, then I tend to forget about it. Yeah, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. And it's so crazy that way, because there's an old joke in the business about people talking about, yeah, I never liked the way that record sounded until it went into the top 10. And maybe all of your insecurities about what you're doing, what you're trying to put out, are alleviated when the record is successful. It's kind of silly in that regard, but yeah, I'm my biggest critic for sure.
When an album, after it's mixed and ready to go, does it sometimes lose quality after it's pressed? I've heard stories about where sometimes maybe some of the bass is lost in its particular album, and the artist will say, well, it didn't sound like that when we finished it in the studio, but somehow from between that point and by the time it got out, something happened.
Yeah, well, trust me, when we turn in a record, the turning in, it goes to a mastering engineer. And back in the day when there were LPs, there was a lot of art in that because it's a mechanical process. There's a lacquer master that sits on the lathe, and everything to do with how they can portion the music so that the grooves don't crawl over each other, that kind of thing. And in that process, a lot of the time, the easy peasy way to make that an easier job was to, in fact, reduce the bass, because bass is what the excursions that you see when you look at at an LP is by and large the low end, because the low end is what fattens up the grooves. So that's probably what happened when that was mentioned. Fortunately, I spent my career with the famed mastering engineer Doug Sax, who's no longer with us, but he would fight hard to not have to do that. A lot of at the time when he started in '69. A lot of the mastering houses, especially the major studios that had their own, Capitol, Columbia, RCA, they, as a matter of fact, would just had a high pass filter, filtering all the low end out, that they would just run the music through to make that mastering an easier job.
And in those days with vinyl, you had to consider how many songs you could put on there and which songs you were going to put on side 1 and 2. There was only a certain amount of space that you had to work with, whereas we get to the CD era.
That's correct. That bass thing was all a part of that space management.
So does that explain why, because people always will talk about how vinyl just sounds a warm sound, is that common for term they use. It sounds warmer. What is it about vinyl that just makes it sound so good? Like you're in the room with them.
Okay, well, the thing is this, not so much vinyl, but analog tape, which is what you associate with vinyl, because from the time we got that from the Germans, that's what you heard for music. Everything you heard was on analog tape. And analog tape has a sound, and it is not a mirror at all. When you hear what's coming through the glass from musicians and you play back the tape, it's not exactly what you just heard, without going into too many details that your audience might find boring. But I think that's where that warmth comes from that you're talking about. And on the other hand, part of the warmth comment came from the fact that when CDs came out, they were in fact early digital was in fact not very good, and it was cold. And by comparison, it makes analog warmer. Here, almost coming up on 40 years later with digital, we've learned a tremendous amount about it, and we can now make an excellent recording on high-end digital.
It's interesting to see with the recording equipment that we have now, when I see current day recordings as opposed to something that maybe I'll pull directly from vinyl, and the waves you could just see. The newer stuff is just one big block going from left to right, whereas that classic stuff, it's got all the beautiful waves going up and down.
Yeah. Now the deal with that, this is very unfortunate. What happened is we come up with digital, and we have this incredible 110 whatever it is dB dynamic range. But, we always had level wars from I think it started with the 45, and, whether this is the sum total of it or not, I don't know. But my version of it has always been that the louder was always better, because on the radio, especially AM, if the record was louder, it was louder. By the time we got to FM, they were doing a lot of compression on the signal to make it go farther. But so the guy goes in, promotion man goes into a radio station, and he's got the new record by XYZ, and the DJ is playing, puts a record on, and while he's got 3 minutes to talk to the promotion man hands him the new single. He puts it on his other turntable and plays it just in his control room, and he goes, "Oh, it sounds pretty good, but it's not as loud as this record that's playing right now, is it? It's not going to jump." So that did become a thing where they had to have louder records. So we've always had a level war, even with LPs. They always wanted, every artist wanted their record. If it was on a changer, and whatever kind of music was their genre was, and their competition was on the turntable, and their record plopped down as next, and it wasn't as loud, they would complain to the mastering engineer, "Our record isn't as loud." So we've always had that level war. Well, we come to digital with this the ability to have, as you were pointing out, the old squiggles that you see from an analog recording, an LP. And what do? We just take total advantage of it and cram it up so that we, take all the dynamics out of it, which is very unfortunate for music. And now we mix music that way even more so. So it's a big reversal of what it could and should be, in my opinion.
Getting back to Richie Podolor, you studied under Richie, who produced those classic Three Dog Night recordings. You call him the single most talented musician, producer, engineer I've ever met. That's saying a lot. You've heard and watched many. What makes him the best?
Well, my opinion is because he is an astounding, accomplished guitar player, classically trained, and yet a great sense for songs and hooks. He understood pop music and hooks, and so his production style, records like lots of those classic Three Dog Night records, and then he, as it turns out, he also became a phenomenal engineer. So that's definitely who I modeled myself after, and I think I said in the book that I thought I would never be as good as he was, and I'm pretty sure I was right.
Well, others will say differently, but you're being modest. You've worked with some big names like Carly Simon for her 1972 album, No Secrets. You were the engineer for that album. The song Night Owl, written by James Taylor, Linda and Paul McCartney on backing vocals. That's the album that has You're So Vain on it. And you received your first Grammy nomination. That was for Best Engineered Album. That lost out to Stevie Wonder's Talking Book album. But you were up against some big-time classics that year, including an album called Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. You thought the award should have gone to that album, Alan Parsons, the engineer. I'm curious, as a huge fan of Pink Floyd and that album, as a producer and engineer who's seen and done it all, what are your thoughts on that album from a producer/engineer's ear that stands out most with that album? Because this is during a time when they didn't have Pro Tools.
Right. But I mean, I love the analog era for sure. A big fan of it, obviously very fortunate to have worked in it and had a lot of success in it as well. But what can I say? That's just an exquisitely made record with some really great songs and outstanding production and sound by Alan.
Just a team effort by everybody, because I believe Roger Waters and David Gilmour, they all had their ideas and let's try this, and Roger going home and recording all the audio stuff, and I believe Alan did the clocks and all that stuff. But
yeah. Meanwhile, the next one, The Wall, is no slouch either.
Absolutely. What happens when an artist decides, I don't need a producer anymore? That can be dangerous, right? Because sometimes as those artists get further in their career, they say, I don't need one.
Yeah, exactly. I think, all artists need time to develop. One of the saddest things about where the record business has gone today is that, that not enough, there's not enough records and not enough artists being signed by record companies, and they don't give them the time to develop the way they used to. But as Clive Davis told me when he gave me my break, all artists are going to fire their producers eventually. If something goes wrong, they're going to blame the record company, or they're going to blame the producer. They're not going to blame themselves. So undoubtedly, they're very likely to fire the producer. And I don't know percentage-wise, but in lots of cases, it's probably uncalled for. It's really not quite right. And there aren't a lot of artists that can produce themselves, to be honest. It's very hard to remain objective. I know, as I left being an artist and found my artistry in producing and engineering in the board, I know that behind the board, I know that one of the roughest things for me to be objective about is when I mix things that I produced. I've always felt I do a much better job when I'm mixing someone else's record than I am mixing my own, because I've lost my objectivity to a degree.
That's
And
the thing,
I
yeah.
tried working with other mixers, but I drove them crazy. So I've just been stuck with having to fight my own battles.
It's only natural, I guess, for every artist to just not want to have to deal with someone critiquing their work and telling them what to do, what not to do. It's only natural, but also the upside is that the result can be much better because of it. It's kind of like I always think of when Babe Ruth became a player manager. Right? He was never a great manager, but a great player. And there's a big difference between the musician and the one who's behind the boards.
Yeah.
Your first experience working with a Beatle, Ringo Starr, this was for his 1973 album titled Ringo, and he was every bit you had expected, animated, lighthearted, and you also got to meet George Harrison, who stopped by the recording sessions, which were in Los Angeles at Producer's Workshop, and this led to the song Photograph, one of Ringo's biggest hits. Talk about that song and the wall of sound approach that you had with that one.
Yeah, we started the record with just Ringo, and a couple of days later, George showed up, as you said, and he liked what we had been doing and overdubbed actually on it, and then he showed a song that he had produced on Ringo. That was Photograph, and it's actually lyrically a kind of a somber song, and his version was definitely a little more somber, and it's because the poor singer has lost his girl and all he has is a photograph, and the decision was made, I think, by Richard Perry, so why don't we recut it with a Phil Spector wall of sound kind of thing, and so that's what we did, with a choir of acoustic guitars and whatnot, and then actually went on and got Jack Nietzsche, who worked with Spector, to do strings and a choir on it, and made it, the great single that it was, his biggest single.
Is the goal of the wall of sound to create a sound in which the listener can't even really discern what instrument is what, because it's a combined sound? I remember Brian Wilson talking about that. You take 3 or 4 different elements and it becomes one, almost like one individual instrument itself.
Yeah. Exactly. It's sort of like where, as you listen, you might if you're listening for things, something will drift in and drift out kind of thing, that kind of thing. So it's, what you say, kind of just a unified sound.
And Brian Wilson, a huge fan of the Wall of Sound. He was there. Billy Preston, Mark Bolan, Peter Sellers also showed up. But things, as you write, reach a new level of nervous when Ringo tells you John Lennon is coming in to work on a song. So you've got John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, 3/4 of the Beatles, sitting there in the studio, ready to record a song John wrote called I'm the Greatest. Now, this is the only time 3 former Beatles recorded together between the band's breakup in 1970 and John's passing in 1980. What was that like? You write about how the 3 still had that musical connection during the middle 8 of the song?
Yeah, the thing is that, Ringo had been the jovial chap that he is, and then when George came in, that was fine, and George working on Photograph, he kind of helped run it a little bit like that. But then when John came in with his song, it was just like all eyes went to him, and of course it was, those I wish we had film. Boy, it'd be great for those first moments when they saw each other, but because it was a little tense. I mean, John just kind of. The person that he was, his eyes were always flitting and hard to see emotion almost in a way. And yet everything that came out of that guy's mouth was brilliant when it came to music. It was amazing to watch him. And so they started playing, and it was obvious that John was going to run the show, and that when he was happy, we'd be happy. We'd all be happy. We'd have the take. And as you said, that is the only time that 3 of the Beatles ever played together after the breakup of the band. And the saddest thing about it is that Paul was in England and had a drug bust, and he couldn't come in America for 9 months or something. And there's a very good chance that if he could have come over, knowing that everyone was kind of giving Ringo a leg up, that he would have come over, and we could well have had a Beatle reunion. We'll never know, of course, but Paul and Linda did write a song for Ringo for that album, and we went to England to record it.
Do you think they would have ever worked again together as the Beatles?
I think there's a very good chance because, I think most of the agita that had been created between those two and that whole thing had calmed down enough that, it's one of those things under the guise of helping Ringo. You would tend to, forget about the past and some of the stuff, and let's just all chip in and help, which is what they were doing, exactly what they did. And that's why I think that there's a good chance that if Paul could have been there, that on his song, we might have started, with all four of them.
Sure, time would have healed those wounds. And I always say, too, if it was for charity, if it was something real important, like Live 8 with Pink Floyd, it would have happened. You also got to see the inside of George Harrison's house, which was more like a castle. What was that like?
Exactly like a castle. Yeah, absolutely astounding. With a skull and crossbones flags lying overhead. Even just the gatehouse, is an absolute work of art. But yeah, it was just an amazing, amazing place, and an amazing time as well, because he had invited us out to the castle on the weekend, and Patty, who he was married to at the time, they were vegetarians, and she cooked for us, and I at the time I was eating meat. I stopped eating red meat in 1979, but back then I was still eating it. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's not going to be any meat. What weird people, I can't imagine. But when she made the meal and I had it, I went, wow, I would never have to have meat if I could eat like this. I learned right then that, people that know what they're doing as vegetarians can really handle it. I've never gone all the way to vegetarian. I eat chicken and fish, but it was a fabulous, fabulous time.
Back in those days, there were no phones with cameras. Otherwise, you would have had that thing out. And,
yeah. One of my biggest regrets is that I was never into self promotion. I've always looked at myself as a servant to the music, whatever I was doing. So it wasn't ever about me. So I never got any pictures, as the publisher will complain about in the book, that there aren't enough good pictures. Although I did get a bunch more that are on the website like that. But yeah, it would have been great to have real documentation of so many things that are in the book.
I think I came across your website. Is it BillSchnee.com? Or is it BillSchneeStudio.com?
No, just BillSchnee.com.
Okay.
The thing is, when I turned the book in, it was 160,000 words, and they said it has to be no more than 100. And so I worked with an editor for a long time to get it down to what it was. And I was bemoaning the fact that over a third of the book and all that work was thrown out. And someone told me, why don't you get a website for the title of the book and put it on there? And in the book, tell people that if they want more, they can go to it. And so I got a company to build the website, which turned out to be a branding company. And they said, why do it with the title? Do it. You've never done anything with BillSchnee.com. And why don't you do that? Because you're more than a book, and just put it there. So that's what it is. Right in the book there's a place where it says, if you want more, go to BillSchnee.com. There's a tab called Got a Key, and you put the key in, which is a certain word, and go, and you'll get 60,000 words and a whole lot more stories that a couple of people in the reviews have said are better than the book. I won't tell the editor that, but there are some good stuff and a lot more pictures. The other fun thing that I was able to do is I put YouTube links in when I'm talking about songs, so that you can kind of follow along musically.
Oh, that's great. What a great promotional idea. I'm looking at it here. If you finish the book and still want more, put the key phrase that was given right before the appendix into the lock. What a great idea. The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. You mixed Art Garfunkel's solo album Breakaway from 1975. Richard Perry produced it, picked out songs for Art to sing, including the Flamingos' classic I Only Have Eyes for You. You wrote about Art being a very intelligent guy, but you're right, sometimes intelligence can get in the way of the mixing process. That's interesting. That's a lesson to be learned there, right? Let the right brain do the driving, as you write.
Yeah, well, that's, speaking for myself, and that's the way I look at it. I think, I like creativity. I like to, I'm a pretty energetic, a very energetic guy. And I like to work fast, because that's where I think, most of where my creativity will come, hopping from one thing to another, a little like Lennon. Everyone doesn't work the same. Paul was much more, he moved much slower, but the results are just as good. I'm not calling one over the other. I relate to John a little bit better because of how fast he moved. But Yeah, Artie was just, I just found him to be too much thinking about the mixes too much, including, and I think, people shouldn't be thinking that much unless they're thinking about the lyrics when they absorb the music. So why overthink the musicality of it when you're making it? But that's just me.
So someone like Art Garfunkel, without a producer and without a label pushing him, could he be the type of artist that could take 10 years between albums? Because there are artists that are like that get a lot of heat for that. Their fans are just wondering when the next album's coming out, and you read about the artist saying, well, I think it's done. It's almost done. It's probably going to be out next month. And then the month becomes a year and 2 years and 3 years.
Yeah, that does happen a lot. And yes, he probably would be. Now, as it turns out, anyway, he never made that many records with producers.
Yeah, exactly.
But, I don't have a favorite artist or a favorite record, but that album would definitely be one of my favorite records. I think Richard did a wonderful job with the song selection and the way he put it together. And it's one of the albums that I'm actually pretty happy with the way I mixed it. Everything but the opening song, which I guess I've gotten so many comments from people that's one of their favorite songs and how great it sounds. And it's just that I just had a bear of a time mixing it. I could never get happy, which happens sometimes. And back in those days, by the way, I don't know if you're old enough to know that there was a system called Quad that was on LPs, where it was actually 4-channel surround audio, but it was on the LP. You had to have a special player. And there were 2 different systems, in fact, and some of the record companies went with one system and one went with another. We all remember the videotape wars with Sony and everyone else. This was very similar to that. So both of them died. But when I mixed it in Quad, I was thrilled because I was happy with that mix.
Interesting. Okay. Well, wait, I'm thinking Moody Blues, quadraphonic sound, I think.
That wasn't a title, was it?
No, but I think they were utilizing that. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
Like I said, a lot of albums were remixed in the early 70s in that format.
Okay. Yeah, it was Nights in White Satin, that album. The other thing I'm thinking is Dark Side of the Moon, I remember being re-released in quadraphonic sound. Are those coming off the original tapes?
Yeah. Well, Dark Side, I know, was remixed in 5.1 here much later.
Sound, I believe. Yeah, 5.1.
Yeah. And that was done by the engineer that, actually stop. Alan did Dark Side in Quad back in the day. And then the band was not happy with it when it came to 5.1. So they had moved on from Alan to James Guthrie, who did The Wall, and he remixed it. He remixed both albums in surround sound.
Okay. And you were an engineer on Steely Dan's classic 1977 album, Asia. At this point, they were a non-touring studio band, a partnership between Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. They brought in studio musicians for recordings, which was not common. You had already heard that Donald and Walter were extreme perfectionists, but that wasn't going to stop you from working with them for obvious reasons, right? I mean, this brilliant duo.
Absolutely. And arguably, for me, the best news of all was the sessions weren't anything but that. I have friends that had played on their previous records that told me about the maniacal ways and what they went through. And speaking of overthinking things, and yet the tracking sessions, which is all I did for Asia, the tracking sessions were anything but that. They were very relaxed, reasonable hours with these great musicians. Donald and Walter would come in every day with a demo, piano-bass demo, of what we were going to do. Larry Carlton, the great guitar player, had been given those demos and had made chord charts for them. And the sessions just couldn't have been easier and more fun.
Only took a few weeks, you're right.
Yeah, just a few weeks. And then then they went off and and they asked me, they came to me at the end of the tracking and said, we'd like you to mix it. And I said, guys, I'm pretty sure I couldn't do that. And why not? Well, I don't think our styles are going to be the same. And, well, you'll try, won't you? And I said, sure, I'll try. I said, okay, well, we'll go off here. It'll take us a few months to do the overdubs. Now, at the end of 6 months, they had one song ready to mix, which even wasn't, it was When Josie Comes Home, which wasn't ready. It's not the same record that ultimately got mixed. And we did go in a studio, and I spent a day with them. And it's not that I don't do experimentation when I'm working, when I'm mixing, but it was just a little too much of yin and yang for me. I just knew that it wasn't going to work. I wasn't going to be able to do my best, and so didn't work out, unfortunately. But they handed it off to my good friend Elliot Shiner, who did a masterful job and is a much more patient man than I am.
That's what I was going to say. You credit him in the book. You have much more patience than I do. You write about the New York jazz drummer Steve Gadd, another legend as good as it gets. He lays down the beat for a song called Were You Blind That Day? And you sit back afterwards and think, man, that was perfect. But afterwards you hear Donald and Walter saying they weren't happy with the backbeat.
Yeah, I overheard them talking that they weren't happy with him, and I went, him who? And they said that it was him and Steve, and I said, what's wrong? And they said, well, we like a backbeat like Jim Keltner, which is a little behind the beat. Keltner plays always a little behind the beat, just the teeniest bit as part of the feel. And I said, yeah, I know, but listen to what he played. And obviously they came around because the title track of the album is the one that he played on. So
the idea of playing behind the beat is the artist wants a little more of a groove to it. Is that what they're looking for?
Well, it depends on how you define groove, because there's great drummers that play right on the beat, John Robinson, and that's a kind of groove too. It's just a little more relaxed kind of feel, even on an up-tempo song. I go into that a little bit. It gets a little nerdy for some people, I'm sure, when I talk about how, what it really is, because it's how the brain, how each individual drummer, how the brain coordinates the four appendages that they're using on the drum kit. And it's obvious that some guys like Keltner, that left hand, that he is a right-handed drummer, the left hand on the snare, just for some reason, he thinks it's good that it comes down a little bit, more relaxed on the beat. If you put it up against a click, then perhaps the bass drum, which would be maybe more right on the click.
I think that stuff's fascinating. Personally, I love reading that stuff, and I think a lot of people enjoy it too. As long as you put it in, you throw it in every now and then, because for some people, they're not going to understand exactly what that means. So it helps them to understand it more, and it helps them next time they listen to the song. They're listening to it from a whole different perspective. So I love when that type of information is in a book. And by the way, that track, Were You Blind That Day, that did end up on 1980's Gaucho album with new lyrics and a new title, right?
Yeah.
Third World Man. And Steve is on that recording, right?
Yeah,
that's him.
And the funniest part of that to me is that when we got called up for that won the Grammy for Best Engineered Album also. And when we got called up for it, as I'm walking up, I asked Elliot, "Can I speak first?" As we're walking, he said, "Of course." And I went up and I said, "Guys, this is kind of silly. I'm really only along for the ride on this one, because I cut that one track. That's it." And Elliot went in next and he said, "Are you kidding? If it wasn't for that track, we'd still be making the album."
That's great. Like you said, Steve is on the title track to Asia. You write that you can even hear him accidentally hit the sticks on the take, and that ends up on the album. I love that kind of stuff. That's during his drum solo, right around, for those who want to hear it, about 4 minutes, 57 seconds in. I look for it. What a beautiful song. Opens with that piano, goes into, as you write, the most complex and interesting progression you had ever heard or would hear. For the non-musician listening, what is it about that song, Asia, that led you to that observation?
It's, back up the teeniest bit to say that everything on that album, when we were doing it, that it was, there's no question, it was groundbreaking. And if you can imagine here, I've been doing a lot of really good records by the time I did that, but I'd never done anything like this, because I don't think anyone had ever done anything like this. And so literally every day when I got in the car, and I'd make a cassette of whatever we had done that day, and I'd pop it in as I was driving home, and I would just commenting to myself day after day, what in the world are we doing here? Because it doesn't sound, it's got a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's, it's jazzy, but it's not jazz, and it's got some rock elements. It's certainly not rock, and once in a while it's kind of bluesy, the different songs. And don't know what it is. All I know is it's great, and I love every bit of it. And that particular song, which my good friend Michael Omardian played piano on, and he recounted to me how that was the hardest one in the rehearsal stage, partially because it was so darn long too. You know, it was the FM cut. We used to call them FM cuts that would never get on the radio. You know, they were too long, but certain stations on FM radio would play them. And because it was difficult for sure. And so it took the most time to rehearse, and yet we got it in the second take. And I still don't know. And I've been accosted by fans of the band that know more about them than I'll ever know. That's the first take. And so I don't remember. So I don't know how they know it's the first take, but whatever. It is the one with the stick click. It makes sense in one sense, but if there were stick clicks that they would want to do another one, and went back and listened and decided to use the first one, but who knows?
What a solo. Those who are Steely Dan fans like myself, just a credit to you and the whole team. It's just the most pristine sound. It's just like no other Steely Dan in general, but that album is just, there isn't a flaw on that album. Even leaving in the little sticks in there is just, it's just beautiful.
I love that kind of stuff, you know, early on, around that time, probably in my career, which is kind of early on, I was saying to some of my friends, you know, we don't make records for the people that buy them. We make records for each other. You know, we're perfecting things and doing things that, you know, in a lot of cases that the normal people that were going to enjoy the music, you know, were way overdone. Now that's today. Let me jump ahead and say that that's absolutely the asininity for me of what's going on today. Like this whole thing with absolutely perfect vocals where you can't sing anything out of tune. So now that we have the technology that we can make a vocalist do anything. We can add vibrato, take it away, change the phrasing, certainly change the intonation so that it's perfect. If that was important to the audience, I won't, but I could name several artists that would never have had careers, that did not sing perfectly in tune, but sang with incredible emotion. And I maintain that it's emotion that speaks to people and not perfect intonation.
It's so true. I just was listening to the Stones the other day. I think about Mick Jagger, and you don't put Mick Jagger up there in terms of range, but try to have anybody else sing those Stone songs.
Right.
It's not the same.
No.
Dylan, trying to think of some others too. There are those out there that, and you have singers out there that do have that range, and they may have had a hit or two along the way, but character, you got to have that emotion. Is he really feeling those lyrics?
Yeah.
You end up winning 2 Grammys, one for Asia, one for the Gaucho album, 1981. What did that do for your career? Winning those Grammys had to have been a big deal.
Yeah, I don't know how it works. You know, all I know is that Richie Podolor, one of the many things he taught me, he said was that the credit that you're going to get on an album is more important than the money you'll make. You're going to spend the money, but the credit will get you the next job, and the credit on that one will get you the next job. And so, you know, obviously doing that album probably turned a lot of people in the industry onto me, so that I'm sure that it worked that to some extent that way.
I have an interview coming up with Judy Scott, who just is about to put a book out on her time on Hydra with Leonard Cohen. Yeah,
as I put in the end of the superlatives at the end, people that I didn't talk about, some that I did. There's a bunch of superlatives, and I think I said artist with the deepest soul. You know, these are people I worked with, Leonard Cohen. Yeah, I did a couple of albums with Leonard, mixing only.
There's another example. Again, range. You could throw that out the window. The way his delivery, the way those songs are put together, beautiful stuff. Beautiful.
Yeah.
You mixed the Joe Cocker, Jennifer Warren song Up Where We Belong, which was a huge hit in 1982, included in the Officer and a Gentleman film soundtrack. #1 in several countries, not just the U.S., won a Grammy. Joel Sill, who was head of music at Paramount at the time, he called on you for the job, and it was to be your job. Basically, your job was to take 2 tracks of Jennifer's vocals and 3 or 4 of Joe's vocals, put them together. Joe never sang the song the whole way through. You could hear him stop singing and ask what came next. Didn't have a comp sheet, which is very important since you need to know the producer's choice of the final vocal performance he wanted. Having said all of that, song came out beautifully.
Yeah, Taylor Hackford was the director of that movie, and the producer of that song turned in his mix, and Taylor didn't think it was good. He didn't care for it. So Joel Sill was working with him, suggested that he give it to me to do it. So I remember on a Saturday morning, he showed up with the tape and handed it to me and said, just make it pretty. And so I'll do my best. And I opened up the box and there was no track sheet, which tells you what's on what track, So I went through and marked down on the console, this track has the bass drum, this has the bass, this, and on and on and on. This is Jennifer, Joe, okay. And then, as you say, there was no comp sheet that says what the producer wanted to use. So I had to write all the lyrics out and made my own comp sheet. And I comped it and did the mix, and yeah, and it was great. And it did, as you said, it won the Grammy for Best Vocal Performance. Of course, my joke is, wait, didn't I deserve that? Because poor Joe, who never sang the song all the way through. But that's all of what we do anyway, every day. That's Hollywood magic, right? Behind the scenes stuff. So that's just a joke that I deserve the Grammy. But yeah, it came out really great. And the funny thing is, the only time in my whole career, when it went to number one, the record company sent me a bonus, which was happily received.
That's part of the whole thing, though. It's a team effort. It's everyone putting their minds together and creating something magical like that. You would never think, without reading your book, I wouldn't have known. Sound like they were in the same room together, singing in one or two takes. And that's always a great feeling for you, right? As a producer or engineer or mixing something, is to hear it on the other end and say, nobody's going to know. Joe is such a great singer too. He was legendary.
Yeah, he just wasn't, shall we say, in complete control of his faculties that day.
Yeah, I did get a chance to see Joe Cocker live, one of his last shows before he passed. I'm glad I did. First and only time I ever saw him live, and he was still putting it all out there. And by the way, that show was with Huey Lewis, so we're going to talk about Huey in a little bit. You're right that you've been fortunate to have, for the most part, very little issues dealing with famous musicians. In fact, you say some of the most monumentally talented people you've worked with showed the least amount of ego, specifically John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Boz Scaggs, Mark Knopfler, David Gates from Bread, you also had a great experience with. But Julio Iglesias, not one of them. He referred to you as engineer. Engineer, can you turn up the bass? Engineer, play that again. And that went on for 2 days, and eventually he started calling you by your name when he realized how damn good you are at your job. It was about time.
Yeah, it was funny. Evidently, that's, as you said, he was just, engineer, can you turn up the bass? Sure. And, it's kind of, please, he had to know my name was Bill Schnee. He's recording at Schnee Studio, but I was only engineer. On the third day, he said, that's a great piano sound. Oh, thank you. A little while later, he says, the drums sound really great. Oh, thank you. And then right after that, it was, Bill, can you do this? And it was like, oh, so I guess I had to earn it. I don't know.
Did you ever think, I'm going to get up and I'm going to tell this guy, hey, listen, pal, I'm Bill.
I've had very good, I got a very good track record working with big artists and all whatnot. And just, like I said, it's a servant's role. I'm there to serve the music. And I just, grin and bear it.
Every now and then somebody would step up for you. Like you wrote about one guy who you'd be in the middle of telling him something, and this person would just walk away in the middle of a conversation. Yeah. You're telling, like, literally mid-thought. You just walk away, but somebody else called him out on it. The producer called him out and said, hey, man, that was rude. And they didn't do it again.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. He was a big, big artist, and I don't say who it is in the book, and that's not because I don't want to throw him under the bus. I'm kind of sorry I did that now, because one review, the guy complains that that was the reason, and the reason that I did it was just to tick people off on purpose. But anyway, yes, and a major artist, he doesn't. And I'm meeting him for the first time, and we're talking, and in the mid sentence of mine, he turns around and walks away. And I just figured, all right, well, we're getting ready to start, so whatever. And then down the road, he comes in, and he's just done an amazing vocal, and it's a big live session with an orchestra. And comes in, and I tell him that what a great vocal that was, and thank you. And he said, yeah, but I'm going to get it perfect. And so I said, well, and right in the next sentence, he does it again. So I talked to the producer and told him what had happened. He said, yeah, in pre-production, he did that to me a couple of times. And I finally stopped him and said, that's rude. You can't do that. But just being the engineer, let alone on a big session, in the middle of a session, I'm not going to call him or anyone else down on anything. So it was another case of grin and bear it. But it was it's one of the very few times in my career, I've always been that I had it was like, I'm baseball and he's oranges. And we just did not see eye to eye on the mixing. And I'm very, very, very concerned always with the artist's voice. And I couldn't make him happy in mixing. He went to someone else to mix it. And one of the very, very few times that has happened in my career.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this.
Hi, this is John Kruth. My new book is called Hold On World, The Lasting Impact of John Lennon and Yoko Ono's Plastic Ono Band 50 Years On. And you're listening to Booked on Rock with Eric Senich.
We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. You've had a great experience with Huey Lewis and the News, one of my all-time favorite artists, one of my all-time favorite bands. And you knew Huey since 1979 when you saw the band perform at a club on the San Francisco Bay. At the time, they were called Huey Lewis and the Express. And
American Express.
American Express, right, because the credit card company, there was an issue there. They said, you better change that name because that's going to be an issue.
Right. So I produced a band called Pablo Cruz, and we had several million selling albums. And the manager called me up one day and said, I want you to come up here and hear a band and tell me I'm wrong. And so I went up and went into this club, Uncle Charlie's, and I heard Huey Lewis and American Express. And afterwards went up and talked with the band when they were done. And the manager called me the next day and said, what do you think? And I said, well, the band's pretty good. They weren't great. The band's pretty good. The songs need work, but that kid is a star. And so he said, yeah, that's what I think. So I worked with them a little bit, and we went in a studio in San Francisco and did some demos. And Bob Brown, the manager, took them around and got turned down by every record company in Hollywood. And it wasn't until Chris Ellis of Chrysalis came up to Uncle Charlie's and saw what I saw that he went for it.
That first album, 1980, didn't take off as you and the band hoped. I enjoy it, but it isn't, and you would agree, I think you even write it in the book, it wasn't what Huey Lewis and the News were about. They developed that sound eventually, but they were kind of, they weren't forced? Were they running more of like a new wave type of sound?
What they started with, what I heard in the club and what we ended up on that first album was this new wave thing that had been going around, where the bass does a lot of eighth notes, a lot of the songs were this kind of thing and whatnot, which I was never that into. But the songwriting wasn't great, and Huey would agree, I guarantee you. And I knew that. And the sad part, the sad part of that story for me is that I told the manager while I'm making the record that I didn't think we had any hits. And he took the three best songs to the record company, and they said, no, we're solid. You have nothing to worry about. And then we had a big playback party, and the head of A&R came up to me at the party and said, what do you think, Bill? And I said, I think we don't have a hit. And he looked at me like I was drunk and said, no, we're fine, and walked away. Well, there were no hits on the record. And then Huey called me one day and was really upset. And I said, what's the matter? And he said, well, the A&R guy says we have to get another producer because there were no hits on the record. And I went through the roof, but inside, but I remember very distinctly what I said to him. I said, Huey, this is a rough business, but you're going to make it. I know that, whether I'm there or not. And I'll be there championing you on. And of course, I went to the record company with this A&R guy and his boss, and made my opinion known. And this is so ridiculous. And but it didn't work. And so then Huey would call me, because we both hit it off amazingly, and we both thought we'd be making records until I was old and gray, and we were old and gray. And so he was very upset with the producers they were running by him when he met with them. And he finally went in with one of them, came by my studio and said, I can't tell you what they just put me through. I'm going to them. I won't even play it for you. It's so embarrassing. If this is what they think we should be, I'm not going to make records. And so the manager got them to, said that won't work. And somehow the manager got them to let Huey go in with the band themselves. And of course, that's even a bigger slap in the face to me because, and the manager knew I was the only one that said there were no hits on the record. But they did the second record. Their songwriting started evolving, but they still didn't have a hit. And he had been in another band called Clover that was produced by the great producer Mutt Lange in England. And he called Mutt and asked for a song. and got what was their first single off that album, "Do You Believe in Love," had a different title. Huey reworked it, and and that was my sad story. Now, in the next album, the songwriting obviously evolved into what it became, into sports, and the rest, is, they say, is recorded music history. I told this story for 10 years, and every time I told the story, I always ended with, "But I wouldn't be surprised if Huey and I get back together again someday." And sure enough, a few years later, after they put out the record that was kind of jazzy, and they had shook up their fans and whatnot, they were trying to get back together, get back on the groove. And the same manager called me up and said, "Come up here, I want to talk to you." And he played me a demo of a song called "Couple Days Off," which I thought was a smash. And he said, "Would you want to get back in the saddle?" And I said, "Absolutely."
You're talking about Small World was the one that they did before that,
right?
1988. It's a good album, but even Huey admitted they were trying some different things. They didn't want to make the same album over and over again.
Exactly, but that's what you always go through. With people that songwriters want to ebb and flow. Real artists want to ebb and flow. It's like when I recorded on Every Street for Knopfler, and when we finished the tracking, I told him, I said, this is not quite the same. There's no money for nothing on this record, that a lot of your fans are going to be looking for. And you might think about doing one more song, but he knows where he's going, and he's happy where he is. And I like to say that some people like that like Mark, they don't care about record sales. I mean, they do, but they care more about what they want to do artistically. So anyway, they got back on with that song. And then let me tell that story about what you alluded to earlier about the dog wagging, the wrong dog wagging the tail. So we cut the song with the Couple Days Off, real upbeat song about the singer had a rough week and he just can't wait for a couple days off. And it's written around these chunky guitar players, the guitar riff. And so when we finished it, we were all very happy with it, turned it in, said this should be the first single. And the head of promotion calls me and says, "We got a problem here with this." I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, the top stations in the country are not playing big electric guitars right now. They won't play this. And if they don't play it, we're not going to get in the top 10. And I said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" He said, "Well, you got to take those guitars off." I said, "You can't. It's written around those guitars. Can't you use acoustics?" I said, "Well, you could, but it's not the same song. I mean, there's no angst in acoustic guitars doing that. And it's an angst-filled song." He said, "Well, please tell Huey to think about it." I said, "Sure." I tell Huey. Huey says, "Is he crazy?" I said, "I tried to tell him." I said, "No, we got to put it out." It went out the way it was, went to number 10. And exactly what the guy said. Exactly. And see, that's just, what can I tell you? If that is the tail wagging the dog.
Should mention Chris Hayes, right? He's the one that does that riff.
He's the one that wrote that, yeah.
Yeah, Chris Hayes on guitar. He's not with the band anymore, but seems like a super nice guy. All those guys seem just so easy to hang out with.
Yeah, great.
You had some great times just having some barbecues with the guys. And which is the one who's a great cook?
Johnny Cola, the second guitarist sax player. He's a great musician. He did all the vocal arranging for the band.
Yeah.
Did a great job on the backgrounds and all that stuff. But oh my gosh, I talked to him, it's been about 5 months now, I guess. And it was like, you still haven't opened a restaurant.
Yeah.
He really hasn't. He's got it, let me tell you.
Yeah, a couple days off. I look back at that. I got so frustrated for you and the band reading about that, because when I first heard that on the radio, I actually heard it on the local rock station here in Connecticut, the New Haven rock station, and they hadn't played Huey in a while. So I thought that was interesting. Wow, they're back on rock radio, and it's because of the heavier riff. But never did I ever think, oh, there's too much distorted guitars on the song. It just never crossed my mind. I've never heard anybody ever say it. It's just strange. Those are one of those comments where you have to walk away. You never expect certain comments from time to time.
And that's one of them. These top CHR stations at the time were, that were so important because, they are the pop stations and in the major markets, and it was only in the major markets. But if you don't get those, you'll never be, you can't go nationwide in a big way. Obviously, like rock stations and smaller market stations and whatnot, everyone loved the song and we're playing it. And the guy said, if this was 3 years ago, or probably 3 years from now, it could have been a #1 record.
I love that song. I don't know if you mentioned the album title yet. It's Hard at Play for those who may not have heard that album. It's a fun album to listen to. I just listened to it again after reading your book, and I gave it a listen again, and I really enjoyed it. There are some great songs on there.
And speaking, it's another thing I knew they had that song when I got with them. And now, of course, I'm going to be listened to, I guess. And I knew we didn't have, I didn't think we had another single. So I was bringing in some outside songs that might have worked. But we still didn't, we got towards the end, I still wasn't happy. And Huey said, let's call Mutt Lange. And he and I got on the phone with Mutt Lange in England again and said, you got something you think would work for me? And he's had a song called Hit Me Like a Hammer. And we did that. And I love that one also. I thought that's a real Mutt Lange song.
It is.
And I thought we did a darn good job with it.
I agree. Absolutely. It's a great groove to it. And there are some other songs on there that didn't make it to the radio. I know they did release He Don't Know, but there's one, I want to say, That's Not Me, written by Michael Ruff, is another great song. Yeah. Yeah. There's Build Me Up is one that Johnny Cola wrote with Huey. Yeah. There's some great, and the other thing that drove me nuts too, with A Couple Days Off, there's that great ending to the song, and maybe you recall this and what went into the decision, but I love when it goes into it's like an instrumental as it goes out, and Chris Hayes is playing on the acoustic. He's strumming the acoustic a little bit, and then he goes back into that riff. And the radio stations would oftentimes just cut that. They splice the end. Drive me nuts.
Yeah, well, because
they're trying to get it on top 40 radio. Is that the reason?
Well, yeah. And they always have their rules, which of course are made to be broken. And when the guy whoever breaks the rule, then it sets the course for other people. But at that time, we've always had limited amount of time because they want to play the most number of records in an hour with all the commercials that they can get in. So at one point in history, it was 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and you couldn't be 2 minutes and 45. And another time it was 3:30 and whatever, but. Yeah, so that was just done for that. They probably played the whole thing on your rock station, though.
They did play the whole thing on the rock station. And then when I would hear it on the top 40, all of a sudden, and they would do that with all that kind of stuff. They did that with A Touch of Grey. They removed Jerry Garcia's guitar solo. I was like, what? You can't remove, and Jerry's solo was all of like 30 seconds. It's you don't need to do that, do you? They did that with, I remember at the time, Bryan Adams had a couple songs off of, was it Wake Up the Neighbors album where they did that too. He had this beautiful instrumental ending, and they would just splice it. It's just the way of the business, especially top 40. They're really looking for that song to be quick, in and out, 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But Huey's voice, you did write something about Huey, which is very true. He said his voice was like a Peterbilt truck. Not so good on twists and turns, but put it on the open highway and it could go for days. He's got a distinct voice. It's him right away.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, they're doing a documentary on him. I was interviewed for it. I think it's going to be really good.
Outstanding.
And, it's so sad, of course, we should say that, what's so sad with this Meniere's disease that he has. And in fact, the book was completely done and ready to go to press when I called him and said, would you mind if I put that in there? And he said, no, go ahead. So obviously I make mention of that and how sad that is, because I can't imagine, the guy that, I mean, that's who he is.
It's an inner ear problem. It's a rare inner ear problem. Prevents him from singing. And he admitted to be.
He can't hear in tune. He can't hear pitch.
Yeah. He can't even sit in on a band and play the harp, right? He can't even do that. I don't think.
No. It's literally like being tone deaf.
He can hear people when they're talking. It's just when you have that level of noise, he said everything just sounds like
right.
As somebody who's just a fan, never met the guy, I've never found myself rooting for somebody more. He does still have that hope that maybe he can return. So as a friend, you're a friend. You must be just rooting for him. He hasn't given up yet.
Oh yeah. I remember when I said, all right, well, obviously you've you've talked to every specialist you can talk to, and what's the word? This is way back when, and he said, they all say it could change, and that's not very encouraging.
No, so I'm assuming this is different than what Brian Johnson of AC/DC went through, because he's been able to return. Brian Johnson, he had an issue where he couldn't sing because of hearing, but they developed some kind of brand new technology that he's able to use. But maybe they'll be able to do that for Huey. Boy, I would love it. Well, we'll see. Hopefully we'll see the return of Huey, and I got a chance to see those guys, I think 3 or 4 times live, and it's always a fun show. So
Great show.
Yeah. So we'll wind down. You did talk about Dire Straits. You did work on the On Every Street album, which was the follow-up to one of the biggest albums in music history, 1985's Brothers in Arms, and you did talk about how it sounded a bit less energetic as Brothers in Arms, but he was okay with that. He didn't argue it. He just said that's just what he wanted to do. But he had some great musicians on that album. Jeff Porcaro, Vince Gill, George Martin credited as conductor and arranging strings on that song, Ticket to Heaven. And he was an interesting guy, very laid back, very chill. You had a cup of tea and biscuits with him. I love that.
The English, I love that. I love recording in England, because when they take their tea breaks, we just go out and have a cup of coffee and start jawing. They go to the break room and they have a proper cup of tea with some nice biscuits and chat pleasantly.
That's great. And he loves cars. I didn't know he's a big car fanatic.
Yeah. And he used to race too, but things have calmed down. I saw him fairly recently, and things have calmed down in that realm for him, the racing realm, that is. Even the cars, I think he sold off some of them. He had a gorgeous collection of old cars, me being a car guy. It was great seeing the garage with what he had. One
of the greatest guitarists and songwriters.
Has to be on everybody's top 10 list of guitar players of all time.
Yep. And before we wrap this up, I have to ask you about what you think of current day music and technology's effect on music, because you did touch upon it a little bit earlier, but you get into more detail in your book, and you quote Richie Podolor, who said there's no substitute for talent. Unfortunately, technology has become a substitute for talent. What's the biggest upside to today's technology and the biggest downside, in your opinion?
Okay, well, let me first say that early on in my career, before I knew that there was going to be a huge change in the road, which was digital computers, I realized that, what I didn't want to be was like the best buggy whip maker. I always looked at the guy coming into the 1900s. There was a family, and they had 3 generations of making the very best buggy whips. And all of a sudden, the guy in 1910, he's definitely making the best buggy whips, but everyone wants a car, so there's no market for buggy whips. So I knew that whatever was going to happen, and that's as well as musical styles. It even applies to that as a producer, or to a lesser degree, perhaps as an engineer, to stay current. So when things changed, and I jumped on the digital revolution. I mean, I went kicking and screaming to digital in general as a form of release at first, because it didn't sound good in the beginning. But like I said earlier, now it can be made to sound great. Unfortunately, like we also talked about, now we're mixing with everything hyper compressed and whatnot, so we don't need to do that. But more to the point of your question would be, okay, the substitute for talent comes in the fact, like I said earlier, we can take a singer now that can't sing that great, and I'm not going to name names, but some people figure it out when they see them live. Although now they have the technology that they can even correct that, 90% of it with technology live when they're not singing. 100% if they don't sing and they play from a computer, which a lot of big acts are doing as well. You think you're seeing everything on stage is working, but no. All the dancing acts, I don't know if any of them Pink, I don't know how much she actually dances, but Pink can do it. But most of those great dancing singers are, when you see them live, it's a pre-recorded vocal. Michael Jackson, however, was not when I recorded his live album, the group's live album. So we do have the technology that allows lessers to be graders, and every step of the way, because now we can, we always had the ability with multi-track recording. You can sit there and even if someone like George Harrison, he's not the kind of guy that's going to sit down. He wasn't a shoot from the hip kind of guitar player. He's not going to sit down and start playing, some great stuff straight away. He's going to work on it and work on it and work it out and work it out. And you'll get some great stuff, but it can be painful. As Jeff Emmerich pointed out in his book about the Beatles, who did, the lion's share of their albums. So that, on a creative level, though, there's a side to that that's really good. And the multi-track allowed us to do that. Now it's even greater with computers, because it's, we have more and better. So that's a wonderful thing. The worst thing about what the computer has done in a way is that because of the fact that now for literally $1,000, you can have professional quality recording capability in your house. It doesn't mean that you're a professional engineer or a professional producer, but every kid starts that way. The recording schools, I just spoke to one yesterday, and I think all the times I talk to kids in recording schools, and these are young 20s usually. How many of you have a hard disk recorder at home? I think there's been one in I don't know, 400 kids I've spoken to, maybe more, one that didn't. So they all have professional recording when they start. And as a result, all musicians today have it. And what has happened is studios are all going down in flames because nobody records in studios. And the problem with that for me, and again, it's not just the old fart that, because technology changes. And so I get it. In fact, I just started producing a girl that I have this incredible collection of old tube microphones, and the only microphone I used was on her voice, which is to say it was all programmed like so many records are today. It was all programmed with drum loops and whatnot. But there's no question that what I miss in great part is the idea of putting a band in the studio together to play with and off of each other, because the synergy that takes place when you put live people together can be absolutely fantastic. Even mistakes can turn out to be great. And today when you start an album with a click track and then start with a drum machine, maybe even if you overdub the drums down the road a piece or whatever, you're never going to have any mistakes, that's for sure. And you're not going to get, putting people on at different times, you're not going to get that camaraderie and what can come from, again, playing off of each other. A very cute story to me is from the great bass player Lee Sklar, who played on so many great records with so many great artists. And starting with James Taylor in his early years, and Phil Collins and the list, and Toto one season, the list goes on. But this is about 15 years ago when the home invasion thing had started, maybe 20 by now. And he said, Bill, when I was a young boy sitting in my bedroom learning to play the bass, I used to dream about a day when I could sit in a studio with great musicians and play with them. And I've been very fortunate in my career to have had that opportunity. Of course, I never dreamed that 40 years later, I'd be in someone's bedroom playing all by myself again. And I think that I love that.
That sums it up. That sums it up. Yeah. People could recognize Lee Sklar. He's the guy with a ZZ Top beard you see in all the Phil Collins videos. Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing. So basically, you can clean up mistakes. You can make somebody who's okay sound good. You can even extend a career for someone who maybe their voice is starting to falter. But the downside is you lose the human element. Speaking of losing the human element, we already have AI at work. It's in the background here on a lot of levels, artificial intelligence. How long can it be before you play 4 Neil Diamond records into the computer and give it, and sit there and type a few things, and all of a sudden now it spits out, type a lyric in, and now it's going to sing Neil Diamond, and you won't be able to tell the difference. It's got to be just a matter of time. They've already made a complete record like that. About 5 years ago they did. So who knows? Hopefully this word doesn't make you cringe. Auto-tuning. Is that? Oh, I am cringing. Yeah. Is there anything good about auto-tuning? Anything? I mentioned it earlier. I'm not a big fan. I think people respond to emotion much more than perfect pitch.
I won't do it myself. I refuse to do it. Not because I don't believe in it, because it drives me crazy. At first it was the artifacts that were in it you could hear, and it drove me nuts. Now they've got it where you can't hear the artifacts as much, so I just don't do it. I get one of the assistants to do it if they have to have it done. But it's all part of that perfection thing that, like I said earlier, when I mentioned it back in the late 70s, we're making records for each other and not the people that buy them. And now this whole thing with perfection it's over the top to me.
Yeah, I guess some artists may use auto-tuning as to accentuate a song, maybe drop it in here and there to maybe.
Well, as an effect, it's great. I mean, you can use it as an effect where you can make the voice sound. We've all heard it where Cher had a huge record with it that way.
Believe
the effect version of it, yeah, where the voice is like an organ because it goes from one note right to the next. It doesn't slide.
Bill Schnee, chairman at the board. The book is amazing. It is out now. It is available on Amazon, among other outlets. Are there any other websites that you prefer people go to get the book, or does it matter?
Doesn't matter, but BillSchnee.com, you can order it right there from Amazon if you want. And then, like I said, the deleted scenes of the stuff that was on the cutting room floor, if it was a movie that's contained therein, is kind of fun after you read the book.
Any social media pages that people can reach out to you and talk to you?
The best way to talk to me is on the website.
Okay, they can contact you through there.
Contact on the website.
And that's BillSchnee.com, Schnee spelled Schnee. Bill, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Great, it's been fun.
Thanks to Bill Schnee for taking us through his book, Chairman at the Board, Recording the Soundtrack of a Generation. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address, thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact us through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.